so much for having me here at the Safe Streets Summit. This is my first time here, but it's a big honor for NACTO to have been invited. We've had a couple of speakers over the years, and I know it's a big deal to be here on the 10th anniversary, so thank you so much. Thank you to the weather for being amazing. My name is Jenny O'Connell. I'm a senior program manager at NACTO, which is the National Association of City Transportation Officials. I'll go through who we are and what that is in a second. But I'm going to be talking today about the work that we did as an organization throughout 2020 and 2021, and that we're continuing to see throughout 2022 and 2023 with cities in response to the pandemic to use their greatest asset, their streets, as a place to respond to the pandemic. So, for those of you who are unfamiliar, NACTO is a membership association of 95 member cities and transportation agencies and transit agencies across North America. We've got 6 members in Florida, some of whom are here. Those members make up about 7% of the state's population, which is pretty cool. And we work with our members in a variety of different ways. One of the main things that we do with our members is we help develop guidance for urban streets, so urban bikeways, urban streets, or urban street stormwater infrastructure, transit street design, city limits, speed limits, which we just heard a little bit about as well. And we also provide support to our members by convening them to elevate their own best practices, ask questions, talk to each other about how to elevate the state of the practice in transportation and street design for urban areas. And that's exactly what we did during 2020 when the pandemic first really altered our lives in the United States. We brought cities together to talk about the work that they were doing to make transit safer for drivers, for riders, the work that they were doing to develop bike, walk, and roll lanes on their streets so that transportation choices could be easier and safer for people who still had to get around, and cities that were providing services on their streets in response to the pandemic. And we codified some of this work at NACTO as part of what we called the Transportation Response Center, in which we put a lot of these practices all together. We sort of brought cities together to talk to each other. We developed a little bit of guidance about the streets for pandemic response. And in the end, this culminated in us being able to offer grants for rapid pandemic response on the streets. And our goals for this program were that each of the cities who we provided funding to had to first address a community-rooted need. So they needed to be coming to us with an application that said, we know that community members want this particular thing on our streets, and we know this because we're working with a community-rooted partner who is helping us work with the community to understand this need. Second, they needed to rapidly respond to that need on their streets. So the program was only 4 months long. They needed to roll out a solution fast. And then third, they had to make a change to the physical built environment. And what ended up happening is that we funded 10 projects in year 1. It was a big success. We ended up being able to fund 10 more projects in year 2. And we funded projects like what you can see in the upper left-hand corner here, which is traffic calming measures at intersections in Baltimore, a street vendor program under the text here in Madison, a public plaza with artists in Denver in the upper right, a play streets program in Los Angeles in the lower right, work with indigenous artists in Fort Collins in the bottom center, and outdoor dining programs in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco. So projects all over the country and solving all sorts of issues that were presented through the pandemic. And what's important to know here is that we were only providing $25,000 or $50,000 per city per project. So basically what we saw cities do with that amount of money was pretty substantial. We saw to collectively these cities be able to implement 5 spaces for learning and play, 3 plazas, 3 voting registration sites, 11 outdoor dining installations, 13 mobility hubs, 4 COVID-19 service sites, 3 bike walk spaces, 2 retail streets, and 8 installations of asphalt art, which is pretty incredible for 4-month projects with $25,000 to $50,000. So that pretty astounding list brings me to my first point, my first takeaway, which is that a good project doesn't have to be expensive, and it doesn't have to take 10 years. And the other thing that we're going to hear a little bit more about from Warren in a few minutes is that you can also reverse it. You don't have to make it permanent. So you can have a good, inexpensive project that goes in quickly and that can be taken out or changed or iterated on after the fact. So I have a few more lessons learned, and I'm going to zoom in on a project that we funded in Durham through this grant program. So Durham applied for funding to be able to roll out 5 shared streets in 2020. And they partnered with a community partner called Spirit House, which is a community-based organization, and a particular project manager named Ideal Ortiz, who's pictured here in the center of the image. And what they plan to do is to basically talk to the residents of East Durham about where they wanted their shared streets and how they wanted their shared streets built out. And what Ideal and Spirit House found out when they went out and started doing community engagement with residents in East Durham was that, yeah, they were okay, happy about shared streets. They thought, yeah, that's okay. But actually, we've been asking for safety improvements in our community for a long time. And the city hasn't been responsive to our asks for a long time. And so what Ideal was able to do was she was able to work with the city to establish, yes, the shared streets, but also to build a number of safety improvements that the city residents had been asking for a long time. So in the end, they did end up building their 5 shared streets, but they also put in a number of traffic calming treatments that had previously gone sort of unresponded to for this community. So they built their 5 shared street improvements, but they also put in 9 traffic safety improvements. They ended up working with about 60 community volunteers in the planning, design, and implementation phases. And then they were able to circulate about $8,000 back in economic activity through local nonprofits, Black-led businesses, and street champions in that community. So this brings me to takeaways 2, 3, and 4. Takeaway 2 is that it's a good time to reimagine rigid contracting and procurement processes. The contract that they established with Spirit House and Ideal was not an open call. They didn't have to do a big RFP. They were simply able to go to Spirit House and say, we know you have a relationship in this community. We know you have a relationship with us in the city, and we want to be able to work with you to implement this project. There were other cities who we worked with throughout this grant implementation process who did have to put out RFPs for things like an awning, or did have to go out and do these sort of extremely lengthy contracting processes through their city's procurement and contracting rules that ended up sort of making the project not happen the way they had intended to. So getting rid of those rigid contracting and procurement processes can enable you as a city or as a government to be able to work with the kinds of contractors and vendors and local community organizations that might not be possible to work with, with a longer or bigger procurement process. Second, relationship building is non-negotiable. So Ideal and Spirit House had relationships and built relationships with community members and were able to understand what people were saying and talk to people about what they wanted in their community. But then at the same time, Spirit House and Ideal had a really close relationship with the city. Ideal was actually on the bike and pedestrian committee for the city, so she had a long-standing relationship with city officials, city transportation officials, and that enabled them to be able to, if not come to agreement, at least be able to have conversations about how they were going to continue their project. And then last here, what's really important and a big takeaway from this project was that the community organizations and the cities leveraged their respective strengths and areas of expertise. And what this enabled them to do is Ideal and Spirit House were able to go into the community, really leverage their expertise in community engagement, community conversation, and the city was able to leverage their expertise in navigating the city process, and then also being able to do the designs and help procure the materials to be able to do the painting on the street. And that enabled them to do a lot more than they would have been able to do if it was just the city or just the community organization. So I have one final takeaway, and to talk about that takeaway, I'm going to pivot to one of the most big things that we saw come out of the pandemic, one of the things that's really stayed with us in the years since the early days of the pandemic, and that's outdoor dining. This is a street in Brooklyn. This is actually the neighborhood that I live in. This is Vanderbilt Avenue. This has become a permanent open street now. And one of the things that we saw in the pandemic is that cities were unbelievably fast to adapt to the need for outdoor seating and outdoor services. We saw this in cities from New York to Portland, Maine, to San Francisco, all the way to Los Angeles. We saw it all over Florida as well. And I end here on this photo of Los Angeles as one of these installations because Los Angeles is a notoriously car-oriented city, and it is unfathomable to imagine Los Angeles taking away a lane of traffic, putting a bunch of water-filled barriers in the lane, setting up some tables, and having people eat there. That is unfathomable prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic created a scenario in which the city of Los Angeles allowed restaurants to be able to do this with their streets. And we're gonna hear from Warren a little bit more about what sorts of events can catalyze these changes. But this kind of change was really important, not only immediately, but also in the longer term for economic development and for people using the streets. New York City is one of the only cities that has evaluated the economic impact of their Open Streets program, which allowed businesses to use the street for outdoor dining and retail. And what they found is that the restaurants and bars on open streets did much better than other streets in their borough. So those restaurants and bars had greater sales growth, they were much likelier to stay in business, and there were actually more new establishments. And I want to highlight a part of a quote here from the executive director of the Chinatown Business District, who wrote that if it were not for New York City DOT open streets, the small mom and pop eateries would not have been able to deploy new expanded safe outdoor dining options. So this ability to quickly respond to the evolving circumstances of the pandemic by using the public street as a way to offer restaurants the ability to do outdoor dining saved a lot of restaurants and enabled restaurants to be able to operate through the pandemic, which was an extremely scary time, especially for restaurants that have very thin margins. So I'm gonna end here with my final takeaway, which is that I am so hoping that we can ditch some of the business as usual processes that we've seen happen throughout time in the transportation world. The pandemic, all of a sudden sort of opened the door for getting rid of business as usual. This is some of the Department of Sanitation workers cleaning up after New Year's Eve in Times Square. This business as usual all over the ground, and they have a business as usual bin, and they're putting all the business as usual into that bin because they're tired of it and they don't want to see it anymore. And I agree. So this ditching business as usual can really catalyze a lot of change and impactful change for people in cities. So I'll just reiterate the 5 takeaways that I have. First, good does not have to be expensive and lengthy, and it doesn't have to stay forever. Second, it's time to reimagine rigid contracting and procurement processes. Third, relationship building is non-negotiable for good project work. Fourth, projects work best when public agencies and their partners leverage their respective strengths and expertise. And finally, please, let's ditch business as usual. Thank you so much. Going to be up here for questions later.
Yay.
Hey everybody, I am Warren Logan, and I am really excited to follow Jenny and Chuck actually, and you'll see a really great thread through all of our presentations. I feel like we could have each swapped our presentations a bit. I am now a principal advisor at a public affairs firm called Progress Public Affairs, but most of the work that I'll be talking about today is actually in my former role as the policy director of transportation and the emergency director of community resilience for the city of Oakland. Just a quick agenda for us today. I'll first talk about the Slow Streets launch that we conducted in 2020. I will then talk about all of the community feedback that we received, some positive, a lot negative. Then I will talk about some of the pivots that we made, and thank you, Jenny, for talking about things that don't have to be sticky, they don't have to be lengthy. We made a lot of changes to this program, and I'm excited to talk to you about how we changed based on that feedback. And then finally, for a lot of the government folks in the room, I want to talk about the structure that we set up from an administrative standpoint to make this all work. I like to put my lessons learned up front so that you know what to look for. First one is that I think we should treat traffic safety like an emergency, that people are dying on our streets every day, and if you knew that up front, that that intersection is definitely going to cause a crash, what would you do today, not in 5 or 10 or even 20 years? Second is, we should be taking a people-first approach. And Chuck, I'm very excited that you had spoken about thinking fast and slow, or excuse me, thinking slow and fast, because I read that book right before launching this program. And so it was a little creepy to see that all of the things that I had learned from that are sort of nested into the program that we set up. The third takeaway here is that we should use those low-stakes pilots to provide better, or excuse me, to get better feedback, right? That people are much better at providing feedback about something that isn't permanent. And finally, I think many of these projects need courageous champions and empowered staff, and I'll talk about that at the end. In April of 2020, Mayor Schaaf, now former Mayor Schaaf, said to our community over Zoom that we would be closing 74 miles of Oakland streets. This map is the adopted and proposed neighborhood bikeway network that we had just adopted in 2019. So I want you all to zoom back several years now, right before the pandemic. But we told people, we're gonna close all these streets and let you just get some space during those beginning months of the pandemic. And for a lot of people, this was a great idea. We received a fantastic acclaim from all of the streets blogs, from different news media across the country, because we were the biggest plan at the time. And I think New York said that they were gonna beat us with 75 miles, and I didn't take that offensively, but that's fine. For many people experiencing this program, this is what it looked like. You and your neighbors were walking around socially distanced with your kids, playing, using sidewalk chalk, and just getting a little bit of space from your family members at times, I think. And we used these kind of awesome signs that just closed the street down. And again, for a lot of people, especially in our wealthier, more affluent, wider communities, this was exactly what they felt like, just a sunny day in California. And in Deep East Oakland, which is our lower income, more POC-oriented groups, this is what a lot of people felt was symbolized for slow streets. And the feedback we got was very different. I had someone call my office and tell me that I was tricking Black people into catching COVID. Someone else said, actually a number of people said, that slow streets is gentrification and that the mayor's office was trying to kick out people of color from the city during COVID. And finally, one of the leading, I won't use his name, but one of the leading bicycle advocates of Deep East Oakland had said, hey, come get this, he didn't use stuff, out of the street. It's creating unsafe driving behavior. So needless to say, we had sort of this very different challenge in the two parts of our city. And my staff came to me, this is like day 3, and said, I think we need to remove the slow streets from East Oakland. And I had just read Thinking Fast and Slow, and I said, I don't think that that's what they're telling us to do. I don't think that people genuinely would show up to the city and say, please make my streets less safe. Take away traffic calming measures. More importantly, and this is the part that I think a lot of people forget about time, is that just a few months before launching this program, I had gone on an apology tour because a mother and her child had just been run over by a car outside of a school in this neighborhood. So I told my staff, I don't actually think that they're telling us to get rid of this program. I actually think that there's more here, and that maybe our communications isn't clear enough, maybe we've lost trust, but that there's more to talk about. And so we committed to an incredibly aggressive feedback loop with these neighborhoods where we would meet with them every week to talk about what are the types of changes that they wanted to see to the program, understanding that the program was not going to go away. We would morph it into whatever they wanted, but they had all of the city's senior leadership at their disposal to make whatever program they needed. So for anyone who's ever did a transportation project before, how likely is it that you're going to make changes every week to your transportation project, right? We would meet on Wednesday, we would finalize the plans by Monday of the next week, we would have the media release and then implement the following Saturday. And then the next Wednesday, we'd say, how did this go for you? What other changes can be made? The first sub-program of Slow Streets was called Essential Places. One of the major areas of feedback that we received was, we're not walking around in our neighborhoods. We're actually all essential workers still. We're going to work. We're driving still. What we do need help, though, is getting to the grocery store, getting to the pharmacy, getting to the clinics, getting to the testing sites. And it just so happened that because I was also the Emergency Community Resilience Director, my team was setting up the testing sites as well. So we were able to reorient a number of the slow streets and these essential places to help people get to these necessary locations at the beginning and middle and end of the COVID emergency. What you're seeing here is a bunch of orange cones that are really, really easy to set up. I think all of us have seen orange cones before, and we put them everywhere. In fact, we ran out of orange cones and had to order thousands more, and we had to make a deal with a number of the cities in our kind of 9-county Bay Area about who was going to get which type of traffic calming material. We chose cones, San Francisco chose sawhorses, and we ran out of each one of those things. The second program that we did, building off of that trust with community groups, was we launched an art program. We did not receive money from NACTO, and that's okay, even though we applied. But what we did was we actually hired a local artist who was actually against the program. We wanted his unvarnished feedback about what went wrong in those early months. And he said, your signs don't make any sense. A lot of people think that this is just a construction project, which kind of makes sense, right? That, it's a term of art to say road closed to through traffic. That doesn't really mean anything to anybody other than, no offense, traffic engineers and transportation planners, right? And so he pushed us to think about what's the kind of iconography that we want to use on our streets to tell people kids are at play and that this street is for you. And so we launched this kind of sub-program to reimagine a slow street in DP Stokeland with these types of signs, and ultimately have now adopted a number of the sort of stencil art into our slow streets like standard signs. I wish I could zoom in for a second, but I want you all to notice the upper left-hand corner of the slow street sign. That is a picture of two girls running, sort of towards the frame. And then to the right, you can see a standard pedestrian sign. Hopefully, you all can see that there's a lot more life and interest in that upper left stencil. And one of the things that I noticed was young black girls wear their hair in like kind of pom-poms, like the kind of buns, and that a number of our black staff had said, hey, I think I know young girls who look like that in these neighborhoods. And it was really special, and it was a subtle detail to sort of show people that we're reflecting the community back to them, even in our infrastructure, and our most basic infrastructure is a sign. And that this had this really meaningful engagement tool with the community groups to say, we're talking about you. We want you to be safe. We're not making this program for people to just bike through your neighborhood. We want you to feel like it's a part of you. The last piece I want to stick on for just a second, I think we'll kind of talk about this in our panel, is that this team was built, I think, to be successful from the start. So I was the mayor's policy director of transportation and became the emergency director. For show of hands, who's a government staff here? Okay, that side of the room. I'll talk to you for a second. When you all sign up to be staff, I think this is true for most states, you also sign up to be a disaster service worker. And a lot of us are like, sure, how many disasters are there gonna be? Well, turns out I ended up having to really lean into that for 3 years of my life. So pay attention to those things that you're signing. In addition to me and the team, we had my kind of co-lead from the city administrator's office. So Oakland is not really a strong mayor system, but for many of you kind of know the weak and strong mayor system. We had our traffic safety division manager, who really was the one who signed off on every single change to the right-of-way. We also had our deputy city attorney for land use, who was able to tell us, we're gonna get sued if you do it this way. Please do it that way. And one of the things that he shared with me, and this I think we'll talk about in our other conversation, is that if we indemnified the city or asked neighborhood groups or nonprofits or even businesses to kind of keep us out of it, it gave us a lot of room to work with in a way that I'd never seen this guy who's usually we go to him when we need a no. The other two folks I thought were really important for this conversation as well. Our real estate manager for economic development, who was actually bounced around from a number of different departments, was able to kind of tell us, hey, we've got a city property right next to that slow street. We could set up a testing site there. We could set up a market there. Let's work together on this, sorry. And then finally, our government affairs manager for the transportation department. She was really instrumental in making sure that our transit network knew about all of the different slow streets. She also contacted Google and Apple and made sure that they removed the streets from our navigation network. A lot of you probably don't think about that, but a good way to get traffic off your streets is to work with Google and Apple to remove certain streets from the navigation. She was really instrumental in that. The point I'm making here, though, is that normally when we plan streets and capital improvements, each of these folks are involved, but they are involved at different steps of the process. Having us all in the room, underslept and overcaffeinated, was really helpful to make sure that we were talking with one another right from the beginning so that we could commit to community groups to say, yes, we're gonna say yes to this, and we already have all agreed to this. We're not gonna say yes now and then go back later and say, I'm sorry, my engineer said I couldn't. That breaks trust. And so having us all together was really critical. So anyway, I'm incredibly excited to chat with all of you about our work, and just to remind everyone again, the lessons learned from the Oakland Slow Streets pilots were first that we should be treating traffic safety like an emergency. If you think someone is in an unsafe situation on a corner, on a street, let's do something today about it, not 10 years from now. Let's take a people-first approach and consider that they are not necessarily advocating for unsafe streets, but they are advocating to be involved and to make sure that they understand the process. Using low-stakes pilots can be an incredibly useful tool to help people see that our roads are very flexible, and that finally having courageous champions and a staff that feels empowered will help them make really innovative solutions to our everyday challenges. So with that, thank you, and I'm excited to join in our conversation.
Yay! All right, very good. This doesn't even, I don't have any use for this. Okay, so this is the part where we're gonna open it up for you all to ask questions using the Slido. I got a message to just let people know, if you're trying to get on the Wi-Fi, the Wi-Fi setup is Safe Streets Summit. That's the actual network. And then the password is 10 years. So use that, get in the Slido, start putting your question in. You can also upvote questions you think are really good someone else has already asked, and we'll try and ask some of those. I'll just ask you both to get started though, and you started to talk a little bit about this in this presentation, but there was a lot going on when all of this started happening. What were some of the administrative pieces or policy pieces that had to fall away or change or move quickly to allow some of this stuff to happen?
That's a great question. I want to flag something that both the mayor, my boss, said to me when I joined the emergency team, and when the city administrator, who was the head emergency director, said to me right after. You need to be helpful. And I know that sounds like duh, but I think for government officials, we're not always in that mindset, right? Be helpful. If someone is asking for help, don't just send them down a rabbit hole. You actually have to be a little bit more responsive. The administrative change that I think happened, the most important one, was that we gained emergency authority. That I could say, we're gonna go left, and then we would go left, and that we stripped away nearly every level of bureaucracy to make most of this happen. The council, so we have a mayor and a city council and a city administrator. The city council and frankly the mayor were sidelined, and we moved up a series of department heads and policy directors into these emergency teams, and whatever fell into our sort of work plan for the response for COVID, we had, I don't want to say carte blanche, because the rule was we had no money but all authority. And you'd be surprised how $0 gets you moving. I mean, our Slow Streets program cost us $200,000 over the course of 2 years. And that's mostly staff time, right? A citywide program of, we completed about 35 miles or so of the 74 for $200,000, I think really rested on that emergency authority. And that's something that was so critical.
Yeah, good.
I think that's part of the reason why treating traffic safety as an emergency is so important. And there are other emergencies that are sort of all around us and happening all the time, and that are emerging all the time, but that are sort of persistent all the time as well. So I think being able to think sort of outside the box of, standard practice until it's pandemic is a really useful way to be able to think about doing, innovative things with your streets, because the truth is that there is always an emergency going on.
Yeah. So we've got a question here, which I'll ask, and then I want to follow up a bit. But the person is asking, how would you decide which neighborhoods to prioritize some of this kind of work that you did? Like, do you start in a downtown and uptown shopping districts, lean towards fixing an area that people already drive to? And I know you worked in a lot of different places. Did you see, I'm sure people tried different things. Were there lessons learned in sort of what worked, or was it space to space?
This is a good question, and it's something that a lot of cities struggled with, and I know that Oakland in particular struggled with this. So Warren presented a map at the beginning that sort of, served as the kind of blueprint for where they were gonna do their slow streets. But a lot of cities, I think, took the approach of, there were a bunch of different things that cities did. One was that cities were somewhat reactive to what was just happening among the communities. So there were communities that were putting out like cones that they had on their own, and cities were often following that. So that's an interesting thing that some cities were doing. I think cities were trying really hard to be able to sort of recognize that not all communities within their cities are the same, and people had different needs within their communities. Sometimes that happened a little bit later, as Warren was mentioning, with the Essential Places initiative in Oakland, but there were communities within cities that had a large percentage of the population still going to work, and that was not true of every community within a city. So I think that some cities tried really hard to sort of emphasize, connections for work for communities where there was a lot of people still commuting to and from work, different interventions in communities where people were mostly working from home. But I think that one of the things that was interesting during this sort of early stage was that there was no previous plan. And so unlike a lot of transportation interventions where you see a lot of planning work, and then implementation, and therefore you see sort of a similar approach across cities, the approaches really differed from city to city because there was no plan in place, basically.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny that you say that, Jenny, because I think what made Oakland's situation quite special is that in 2019, the fall of 2019, so like just a few months before COVID and then slow streets, we had adopted our bike plan. So we had gone through this multi-year process of talking with community groups to say, which streets do you want to feel safe walking and bicycling on? And the underlying question that we'd asked about the neighborhood bikeway network was that a lot of people had said, I don't want to be biking on an arterial street. No matter what you do, I don't want to be, we talked about speed differential. I'm not interested in being on one of those streets. I would rather bike with my kids down the neighborhood street, feel totally calm and collected, and not feel like I'm taking my life into my own hands. And so it is ironic, in fact, that having just adopted this network just a few months prior, we used that network as the foundation for our Slow Streets program. And that was one of the underlying issues that I kept bringing to my staff, where I was like, all of these same people just got through telling us these were the streets that they wanted to be traffic calmed, and now you're telling me that they're upset that we traffic calmed them. There's probably something more here than get rid of slow streets. So I think that was, for us, and I think we might have been one of the only cities that had the master plan, but I want to frame something really important for everyone. The Slow Streets version that we launched was already the V2. V1, my staff had come to me and said, what if we just let neighborhoods do their own slow streets? We'll give them the tools, they can use their trash cans, we'll buy them cones, and we'll just let them figure it out. And I was like, I know exactly what will happen. The affluent neighborhoods in North Oakland will definitely do this. None of the East Oakland neighborhoods will be involved in this whatsoever. And then we're gonna hear about how we're the like racist jerks that like only launched the Safe Streets program in North Oakland. And so again, like this bitter irony that we had to like slog through for a couple of months was that we had almost launched the program exactly as you said. And the comparison point is that 2 months after launching the Slow Streets program, we launched the sort of shared streets, parklet, Market Street program that was the opt-in. And that's exactly what happened. All of the affluent neighborhoods have parklets, none of the lower income POC neighborhoods have parklets. And so you can see that while some people criticized us for kind of forcing the program into neighborhoods that maybe weren't ready for it, The other option was to leave them out and never learn about the Essential Places program, never learn about the artist program, never get that rich feedback about the plan we had just adopted. And so it's kind of the road we didn't travel, but we were able to make those comparisons, plan and unplanned.
Are you potentially suggesting that some of these planning processes don't need to take multiple years?
I am. Thank you for asking. Yeah, I think that you can have a long-range plan. Like, we need that because you're not going to spend billions of dollars, off the cuff, or maybe you could. I don't know. Don't do that. But
call me if you do.
Yeah, right. But I think one of the important aspects that we learned was that we were able to get some really great feedback with plastic cones and barricades that helped us then change the long-range plan. And the example that I like to provide for a lot of people is that there's a bikeway that kind of runs from downtown up north into UC Berkeley's campus. That project has taken us 10 years. Like, I was a consultant for the city years ago designing that project and then getting it funded. The neighborhood hated it. They're like, we don't want a bikeway through our commercial district. This is then because they didn't want to lose parking. We all know about the loss of parking. And the irony, of course, is that when we allowed them to have parklets, there is now no parking in this district because they all took away their own parking spaces. And so it tells me that had we done some of these rapid, iterative improvements or pilots throughout the process of that initial design, we would have come up with something completely different than what's there now. And now, we can't really take it back, but it is I'm remiss that 6 or 7 years ago in the design phase, we never really got to get that type of feedback.
There's a bunch of questions coming in that relate to things both of you talked about. You had a point in yours about that relationship building, like working with communities, absolutely, like you have to do it, and you talked about some of the learnings that you did with that. People are asking about how you engage with business owners who might be skeptical, how you addressed some of the concerns about gentrification, and I'd love to hear you talk about each of those, but maybe it's just sort of a general frame. If you could sort of magically go back to like March of 2020 and restart, are there things that you would just sort of do differently, like in terms of the engagement piece and talking to people and the relationship building?
I mean, I think that what Warren has just been saying about putting things on the street and getting people to react to that is such a big part of transportation planning and sort of street innovation that we are not super comfortable with. And I think that actually, I just wish that we were doing a lot more of that. And I think it was one of the big successes that came out of the early part of the pandemic. And I think that, Oakland was probably the most in the news in terms of some of the pushback about the slow streets. And yet it was also one of the biggest programs that people were happiest with. So I think that I don't think that a really lengthy sort of community engagement process was right for the response to the pandemic. And I think we're sort of at a stage now with community engagement and public input. We're kind of at an inflection point in general because it's kind of not working for anybody the way that it's happening now. These community meetings are not super successful. Residents in communities don't feel like their opinions are heard. Cities don't feel like it's a successful, or governments don't feel like it's a successful approach. And I think that I think there are some important lessons learned from the pandemic that can help sort of think through what is a better way to get people to react to something on their streets. And also, what do people's reactions really mean, and taking time to sort of think carefully about what those reactions mean, where they're coming from, who's saying what and why, that are sort of important lessons to put in our pockets and take forward.
Just picking right up where you left off, I don't think I would change it. A lot of people have asked me, like, if you could go back, would you change this program? And I'm like, I would change how much I drank because it's probably more. Like, this was an incredibly stressful time for a lot of people responding to the pandemic. And I think one element that I would change about staffing is that I wish that I was able to give my staff a break. Like, we burned through everybody. Like, none of us work for the city anymore. Like, that's the other side of this, right? Is that we were able to accomplish a ton of stuff very quickly, and then we needed to take 6 months off because we were burnt out. I think the other part, though, and I'm just going to share a quick story about feedback, is that we're on Zoom, it's maybe June. One of the leading advocates in DP Stokeland was like, these slow streets don't effing work. How dare you? This still isn't working. A car, so she's like walking down the street and she's like, see, look, a car just passed me. I was like, okay, I'm the boss here. Do you want me to just go out there right now and get rid of all of the signs? In fact, better yet, you can get rid of all of the signs and then I'll just have my staff pick them up. She's like, no, I don't want you to do that. It doesn't work. I'm like, okay, what you're telling us is on its surface level to get rid of the program. And I think underneath that, you're telling us that you're frustrated, that you want it to be a successful program and it's not. What would you have us do moving forward to make this a successful program? Just like your signs don't work, no one's paying attention to them, and they're just driving around them. You should have something heavier that people can't move. And I'm like, cool, see how we started at remove the street signs and now we've landed at make the street signs heavier so people don't run them over? Like, that type of feedback we were not getting in the 2-year planning process that preceded this implementation. The other component that I just want to share is that I was then able to convince my engineers to literally take the cones, in other places around the city and say, can we put a plaza here? What can we do? And there was a case in downtown where we got like maybe 30 cones and we just took away, it's a one-way street that has 4 lanes, so it's really fast. And we took away 3 of the 4 travel lanes. And we just stood there and watched traffic move. And some of the neighbors came over and they're like, hey, what are you guys doing? And we're like, well, we just want to see if we could put a plaza here. We weren't lying, but we just were like, I don't know, we want to see what happens. And a number of people came over and they're like, oh, can I get a plaza on the other side of the street? Let's do 2 plazas. We were never able to get that kind of feedback. And you all as planners and advocates and government types, right? You show all of this stuff on a plan view, right? We're used to seeing things in CAD drawings or whatnot, but everyday people can't give feedback that way. They're not trained to do that. And I think that going through this process, however clunky and challenging as it might have been, we got a way better set of conditions and feedback than we ever would have gotten. So I wouldn't change anything.
Yeah, I totally agree. The other point I want to make, just about, because you're talking about cones a lot, which I think have been very successful during the pandemic. And I also think that traffic cones and, sawhorses, right, and barrels are construction zone materials. And I also think it's really important to acknowledge that sometimes when community members see cones, barrels, sawhorses in their community, they are not going to like the project because it doesn't look beautiful, and they're proud of their neighborhood. They're proud of the place that they live. They want their neighborhood to be beautiful. So I think that especially during the pandemic, the use of that kind of material was really effective because it was so inexpensive and happened really fast. But I also think it's worth considering when you're doing a quick build project, if there are other materials that you can get and that you already have on hand or that you can procure easily to be able to sort of pop up a project or do a temporary project, because that can be a better sort of model for what the project is ultimately going to look like, because it's never going to ultimately be built out in cones. Yeah.
Jenny, I absolutely agree with you. I'm sorry, I have 10 more
fine.
questions. Stop talking about these cones. One of the things that we were planning on doing, and everything was on fire at the time, was for anyone who's ever been to a Target, those very large red balls that sit in front of the Target? Nod your heads if you're familiar.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. You guys are familiar.
I'm from
yeah, thanks. We had thought about going and getting concrete barricades and painting them bright colors to sort of get people to understand that this thing that we were trying was temporary and playful, but that it could be moved quickly. And that's the part that's a little bit tricky, right? Is that you want something that tells the public it's not permanent. We can change this whenever you want. And orange cones really accomplish that. So there is sort of a back and forth about using those construction cones or whatever. They're not beautiful, but if you're like, I don't want it there, I want it here, then you can do that. And very few other materials allow for that.
I'll just both of you talked a lot about engaging with and working with artists to do a lot of this, which is both great because artists are good at making things beautiful, and as a theater person, very good at building a set very quickly. You had to learn how to do that. So yeah, good stuff. So there's questions coming in, and I'll come to you about this to start. Although I'd love to hear from both of you. You talked a lot about sort of some of the disconnect between like this, if we just pop this up, it was going to work like we knew in wealthier, affluent, frankly, like whiter communities often. And like we didn't want it to then just totally leave out like people of color and sometimes less affluent communities. You talked about some of the work you did. There's a question here that's asking about overcoming, it's Brian asks about how did you overcome a lack of empathy sometimes in wealthier, affluent communities and empowering at the same time residents who maybe weren't as organized within their own communities and even bridge some of that divide maybe or help them understand like how this is working together.
Yeah, Brian, if I understand, Brian, wherever you are, I understand your question that early on, when we set up the sort of feedback loop that I showed, we separated the more traditional like bike ped, walk bike Oakland advocacy groups that are predominantly white from the Deep East Oakland community groups that were not transportation professionals. They were just neighborhood leaders who were pissed. And that really helped kind of not bring the temperature down because people were still yelling, but that like one group didn't have the same issues as the other, and getting a better picture of like what exactly are you looking for really helped us get through this. I will also admit, just sort of personally, I was in a very different position than my safety team, right? Like we had predominantly white staff, and so I had to kind of happily jump into these conversations with my whole body, right? Like to say, I hear you, and I want you to understand that I didn't wake up today and try and trick black people into catching COVID. And like that, though insane, was really the feedback we were getting. And that I think that a lot of community members needed to see people who looked and sounded and acted like them so that they could understand that it wasn't all a conspiracy, which is really hard. Like that's a lot of weight for anybody.
Yeah. Another kind of interesting component of this that we saw in a lot of cities that we worked with during the pandemic, including through the grant program, was that in lower income communities, the transportation infrastructure tends to be worse. The streets tend to be wider. They tend to be faster. Safety outcomes tend to be worse. And so there was, I think, a lot of pressure on city officials and government officials to do slow streets everywhere and to make sure outdoor dining is accessible everywhere without thinking like, well, actually, when we look at the way that our streets are built out in wider, wealthier communities, those streets are places where you're much likelier to feel comfortable sitting on the street and having a meal, as compared to the big arterial streets that restaurants might be on in a less affluent community. So there are big, in addition to the sort of personal experiences that people have in their community, there are big systemic things in terms of where people live and what the built environment is like in different communities that can really impact how people experience their transportation network.
Jenny, you are spot on. Right, yeah, you're right, yeah. And that was some of the feedback that we got from our East Oakland neighbors. They're like, how dare you? You know how dangerous these streets are, and you think this orange cone is gonna do it. And I was like, that's fair, like that's a good point. And again, I wouldn't change it because we used this pilot to go get $20 million from the state for the East Oakland slow streets, right? So like, we wouldn't have been able to get millions and millions and millions of dollars for this neighborhood without demonstrating that our traffic studies kept spitting out faster speed limits, right? Like we were able to show just how dangerous it was with data to our funding sources, right? To then come back with much richer program sets.
Okay, I have one last question from here, and then I have a closing question. So I'm hoping we can kind of do this one as a lightning round, if we can. And this is very much for this kind of audience. Can you describe a success story for convincing a municipality to consider alternative purchasing policies? Ready, set, go.
So what actually really helped us was we didn't have any money. Like when you start with, the construction triangle, like it can be cheap, quick, or quality, and we just said, okay, we don't have any money, so it's gotta be really, really cheap. Telling my staff, like, I'm not gonna give you any cash because there isn't any. So what do you have right now that you can't even purchase? And they're like, well, we have all these construction signs. And I'm like, great, go put those up and we'll start from there. So I think that maybe the policy is whatever, well, to my government folks, whatever your spending threshold is before you got to go to some cities it's like $10,000 before you got to go to council or whatever. Keep it below that, and then say, what can you buy at that cost a lot of, and is it heavy? Like, that was really where we started the conversation.
It's everyone's new favorite game show. Is it heavy?
Is it heavy?
Okay.
Really?
So the last, I feel like this is sort of the $1 trillion question for these are all the success stories and the things that you all did are so great. How do we keep that going without having to have another pandemic or national emergency or crisis?
I mean, I think that having champions, having staff that are empowered to be champions is a really big part of it, and staff that can sort of navigate the system and advocate for big changes that enable you to do fast, innovative things with the streets, and sort of stripping away some of the really challenging, administrative red tape that has made doing things like painting a street challenging for a long time. And that has made things like, doing an outdoor dining program and doing, liquor permitting on your streets really challenging for a long time. So I think that there is sort of an opportunity to look at the those kinds of administrative processes that are really weighing down and slowing down programs, and seeing if those can be changed.
Just to add to that, Jenny, I think one of the things that I left my staff with was, what else looks like a slow street, right? Is it that we do farmers markets on the weekend? Okay, study that, right? We close our streets all the time, and we just don't call it a transportation project. If the municipal utility is out there digging half the road up, everybody's going to move to the other side. That is not seen as a transportation project, but it's really traffic calming for the next year, depending on how messed up the pipes are, right? Starting to evaluate all of the different things we are already doing to our rights of way, and then calling them something else and learning from that is, I think, the other part of this, that you don't need not that I want another emergency, but either you can treat everything like an emergency, and or you can treat everything like a change to the right of way and to study it as such.
On that note, can we all do a big round of applause? Jenny O'Connell, Warren Logan,